My grandfather used to say, "Don't waste time on street vets. They made their bed, now let them lie in it." And those words haunted me that morning, the kind of morning that feels ordinary until you realize, far too late, that it will divide your life into before and after. Back then, I never challenged him. I learned early that silence was expected, that obedience was praised, and that love, at least in our family, came with conditions. But on that day, on my way to meet my fiancé's father, the untouchable, notoriously ruthless billionaire Charles Harper, I broke that rule. I didn't plan to. I didn't even notice it happening. One small act of defiance. One moment of choosing differently. And I had no idea it would unravel everything I thought I understood about loyalty, family, and myself. The morning itself betrayed no warning. October air, crisp and clean, sunlight spilling gold across the pavement. The kind of day that tricks you into believing the world is generous, that the future is negotiable. I'd just returned from 6 months with the Army's Community Outreach Program in Virginia. I was proud of the long nights, the cracked hands, the Soldiers' Reintegration Initiative that put faces to sacrifices most people prefer not to see. But pride never impressed my father, Victor Stone. To him, worth was measured in numbers, not lives. "You're wasting your degree, Rebecca," he'd say, voice sharp with disappointment. "You belong in finance, not handing out blankets to people who couldn't save themselves." He said it like a verdict, and for the longest time I believed him. He wasn't a bad man. He was just a man who measured worth by how high you climbed, not by who you lifted along the way. And now I was supposed to meet another man just like him, Charles Harper. The name alone carried weight. He was one of those old-guard American tycoons, a man who built an empire from coal, tech, and reputation. And for the last decade, he'd lived like a ghost inside his estate in rural Connecticut. He didn't do press, didn't host events. He was known for being eccentric. But Michael, my fiancé, had another word for it. Terrifying. "This isn't just dinner," Michael warned me the night before. "It's a test. My father judges people in minutes. Don't mention the Army. Don't bring up charity. He thinks compassion is weakness." I tried to laugh it off, but inside I felt like a recruit reporting for inspection. I ironed my dress twice, the one Michael picked, a navy blue silk sheath that hugged all the right places. "Powerful but soft," he'd said. Then he handed me a scarf, cashmere cream-colored, soft as a cloud. "This costs $700, he whispered, as if that price tag alone could buy approval. "You look perfect," he said. But there was fear in his eyes. "Just whatever you do, don't be late. He believes punctuality is the measure of a person's mind." The morning went smoothly at first. I caught the early train north, rehearsing polite answers in my head. Art, travel, economics, no politics, no veterans, no emotions. The closer I got to Harper Estate, the more suffocating it felt. The world outside the train window changed from cracked sidewalks and corner diners to marble driveways and silent hedges that looked tall enough to keep out the sky. When the train pulled into the small, picture-perfect station, my nerves were already humming. Michael had gone ahead the night before, so it was just me, my tote bag, my scarf, and the crushing pressure to be acceptable. The plan was simple. Taxi to the estate, arrive 5 minutes early, charm the ghost. But life doesn't respect plans. The taxi stand was empty. The only sound was the slow hum of wind through the trees. The estate was less than a mile away, 10 minutes on foot if I hurried. I decided to walk. I told myself it would calm my nerves, steady my heartbeat. It was a quiet walk, eerily so. Every house looked like it belonged in a glossy magazine. Every lawn looked like it had its own gardener. And in the middle of all that perfection, I saw something that didn't belong. A man. He was sitting alone on a park bench, shoulders hunched, clothes ragged, hands trembling against the October chill. His gray hair was matted, his boots torn. But what stopped me wasn't his appearance. It was the small, dull shine of dog tags hanging from his neck. A soldier. I froze for a second. I heard my grandfather's voice again, sharp, dismissive. Don't waste time on street vets. Then I heard another voice, one that belonged to my late grandmother, a Vietnam veteran who used to tell me, a soldier never leaves another soldier behind, not even in peace. I stood there torn between two worlds, between the values I'd been taught and the values I'd lived. My train lunch sandwich, wrapped neatly in foil, was still in my bag. I looked at the man's face, drawn pale, quietly resigned, and I made my choice. I walked over. "Excuse me, sir," I said softly. "You okay?" He looked up. His eyes were a startling blue, clear, steady, and full of quiet intelligence. "Just cold, ma'am," he said. "Seems I missed the soup line today." Without thinking, I pulled out my sandwich. "It's turkey and Swiss," I said. "Not much, but it's yours." He took it slowly, his hands trembling. "Thank you," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. Then I saw him shiver again, and before logic could stop me, I unwrapped the expensive scarf from my neck and draped it over his shoulders. He looked down at the soft fabric, then back up at me. "You sure?" "Yeah," I said with a smile. "You need it more than I do." He nodded, eyes shining faintly with emotion. "You're a good one," he murmured. Then, almost under his breath, he said, "Semper Fi, young lady." Those two words hit me like a prayer. As I hurried away, I glanced at my watch. 5:12 p.m. I was 17 minutes late. Michael's words echoed like gunfire. He believes tardiness is a sign of a disordered mind. I broke into a jog, heart pounding, shoes clacking against the immaculate cobblestone path. By the time I reached the grand iron gate, my hair was a mess, my cheeks flushed, and my lungs burned. The gate intercom buzzed. A cold voice answered, "Miss Stone?" "Yes," I gasped. "Here to see Mr. Harper." There was a long silence, long enough to make me regret every decision I'd ever made. Then the gates creaked open. I straightened my dress, wiped my palms, and tried to calm my breathing. I told myself it was fine. I told myself nobody would notice a scarf missing or a few minutes lost. But as the massive front doors loomed ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had just quietly changed direction, like a compass finding true north. I'd broken the rule. I'd chosen compassion over control. And somewhere deep inside, I knew I'd do it again. Michael was waiting at the top of the mansion steps when I finally arrived. From a distance, he looked composed. Immaculate suit, perfect posture, that effortless calm he wore like armor. But as I got closer, I saw it, the panic behind his eyes. He checked his watch, then his phone, then me, his jaw clenched. "Rebecca," he hissed through gritted teeth. "Where have you been?" I didn't have time to catch my breath. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "There was this man outside the station." He looked cold, hungry. "You're 17 minutes late," he cut in, voice trembling with fury. 17? Do you know what that means to him?" I blinked. "To who?" "My father," he snapped. "Mr. Harper. He's obsessed with punctuality. He thinks lateness shows a lack of discipline. You might as well have walked in wearing a sign that says, 'Unfit for this family.'" I tried to explain. "He was a veteran, Michael. A soldier. I think he was." Michael's eyes widened in disbelief. "Rebecca, you stopped for a homeless man on your way to meet my father." His tone shifted from anger to horror. "You do realize how this looks, right? You're about to meet a man who owns half the East Coast, and you thought now was the time for charity." "I wasn't thinking about looks," I said quietly. "I was thinking about doing the right thing." "The right thing," he spat. "The right thing is showing up on time, dressed properly, ready to impress the man who holds our future in his hands." My cheeks burned, not from shame, but from the realization that he meant every word. Then his gaze dropped to my neck. "Where's the scarf?" he demanded. I froze. "The cashmere one I gave you. Where is it?" "I gave it to him," I said softly. "He was freezing, Michael." For a second, he just stared at me like he couldn't comprehend the words. Then he laughed, a short, nervous, broken sound. "You gave away a $700 scarf to a bum." "Don't call him that," I said. He ran both hands through his hair. "Unbelievable. This is a disaster, Rebecca. No, you don't get it. You think this is about money or charity or kindness. It's not. It's about control. My father judges everything. The way you dress, the way you speak, the way you walk. One misstep, and he'll decide you're not worth my time. That's how he operates." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "Then maybe," I said slowly, "your father isn't the kind of man I need to impress." He stared at me like I'd slapped him. "Don't say that, Rebecca. Please, not here. Not now." The butler appeared in the doorway just then, tall and gaunt as a shadow. His voice was measured, precise, and utterly indifferent. "Mr. Harper will see you now." Inside, the house felt like a museum, cold, silent, immaculate. Marble floors gleamed under the chandelier light. Oil portraits lined the hallways, faces of men who all looked like variations of the same ambition. Stern eyes, square jaws, not one of them smiling. Michael walked ahead of me, his shoes clicking sharply against the floor. I trailed behind, still trying to steady my heartbeat. As we walked, I caught a glimpse of myself reflected in a framed mirror. Flushed cheeks, hair slightly windblown, scarf missing, a perfect picture of imperfection. Part of me wanted to turn around, run back out into the open air, find the veteran again, and talk to someone who actually saw people as people, but it was too late for that. The butler opened 2 tall mahogany doors, and the dining room unfolded before us like a cathedral of wealth. A long table stretched nearly the entire length of the room, polished so perfectly it looked like still water. At the far end sat one solitary figure. Michael inhaled sharply. "There he is," he whispered. "Don't speak unless spoken to. Smile. Be polite." I nodded, though my stomach twisted. The man at the end of the table didn't rise. He didn't wave. He didn't even look up at first. He just sat there, head bowed slightly, hands resting on the table in front of him. There was something oddly familiar about the slope of his shoulders, the set of his jaw, like a memory that hadn't caught up yet. Then, as we approached, he looked up and my world stopped. It was him, the man from the park bench, the same blue eyes, the same quiet, intelligent calm, the same scarf. My scarf draped neatly across his shoulders. My breath caught, my knees nearly buckled. Michael didn't notice. He was too busy rehearsing his lines. "Father," he began, his voice an odd mix of fear and pride. "This is Rebecca Stone." Mr. Harper's gaze didn't move to his son. It stayed on me. His lips curved almost imperceptibly into a knowing smile. "Miss Stone," he said, his voice low and measured. "We meet again." Michael blinked. "Again? What do you mean, again?" Charles leaned back slightly in his chair. "Your fiancé is kind. She offered me her lunch today and her scarf. I was testing something. Humanity. Most people fail." Michael's face turned white. You were out there dressed like..." Charles cut him off with a small wave of his hand. "Appearances are deceiving, son. You'd do well to remember that." He turned back to me, eyes warm now. "Please, Miss Stone, sit beside me. You've earned the seat of honor tonight." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Michael stood frozen, mouth open, as I walked past him, the marble cool beneath my heels, my heart pounding with something between fear and quiet triumph. I took my seat beside the man everyone in this world bowed to, and he looked at me not like a guest, not like an intruder, but like an equal. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't seen before. The real test hadn't been about dinner or wealth or approval. It had been about character, and I had passed it hours ago. The silence that followed was the kind that hums. You could feel it in your bones. Michael stood frozen at the far end of the table, pale and rigid, while his father studied me with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. Charles Harper, the billionaire recluse, the ghost of Wall Street, the man who could make or break a life with a single phone call, was sitting beside me wearing my scarf. I had never felt so out of place and so strangely calm. "Tell me," he said after a moment, his tone almost conversational. "Why did you stop?" "Excuse me," I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He tilted his head, a faint smile forming. "On the way here, you stopped for me. Most people don't. Why?" The butler was pouring wine. The sound of it filling the glass was the only thing that moved in the room. I swallowed. "Because you looked cold and hungry." Charles's eyes softened. "Yes, but I looked poor, too." That's usually the detail that matters most. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded faintly. The memory of that moment still vivid. The bite of the cold air, his trembling hands, the warmth of the scarf leaving my neck. "I didn't do it to make a point," I said finally. "It just felt wrong to walk past." Charles nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for that answer. Then he turned his gaze toward his son. "And you, Michael? What did you feel when you realized your fiancé had stopped to help a stranger instead of arriving on time?" Michael opened his mouth, then shut it again. He looked like a schoolboy caught cheating. He started. "I was worried about making a bad impression on you," Michael said. "Yes, sir," Michael added quietly. Charles leaned back in his chair. "So you feared my judgment, not hers." Michael's voice broke slightly. "I didn't want you to think she was careless." Charles's expression didn't change. "And instead, you thought she was kind, which, as it turns out, is rarer than intelligence." The butler served the first course, something elegant, plated like a museum exhibit. I barely tasted it. Charles continued the conversation as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He asked about my work with the Army, about my time helping soldiers transition to civilian life. "I'm a public affairs officer," I explained, "but lately I've been working with community programs, helping discharged soldiers find housing and jobs. A lot of them come home to nothing. Some end up on the streets." Charles nodded. "So you're trying to give them back their dignity?" "I guess so," I said softly. "They earned it." "Indeed." He said it with the quiet conviction of someone who had known that battlefield, at least in spirit. I felt Michael shift beside me. Uncomfortable. He hated when I talked about that side of my life. He said it made people feel guilty or, worse, pitying, but Charles wasn't uncomfortable. He was listening deeply. "You know," he said, "I served too, a long time ago. Marine Corps, not Army. But I've never forgotten what it meant to have someone's back, even when the world turned cold." I blinked in surprise. None of the press articles had ever mentioned that. Maybe that was intentional. He smiled faintly. "Money erases history. People only remember the fortune, not the man who earned it." When he finally turned back to Michael, the warmth drained from his voice. "My son," he said evenly, "has been given everything. Education, comfort, protection. But sometimes abundance breeds blindness." Michael bristled. "Dad!" Charles raised a hand, silencing him. "You spent years learning how to impress me, Michael." "But she," he nodded toward me, "she reminded me what's worth being impressed by." The words hung in the air like judgment and blessing all at once. Michael's eyes darted to me, humiliation flashing across his face. He looked at his father. "Are you saying—" Charles didn't answer. He simply lifted his wine glass and said, "To kindness." The last true luxury left in this world. He sipped. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. Charles asked about books, philosophy, and whether I thought goodness could be taught. I answered honestly, though my voice shook sometimes. Michael stayed mostly silent. His usual confidence had vanished. He looked like a man watching his own reflection crack. When dessert was served, a delicate slice of lemon tart, Charles reached up, untied the scarf from his neck, and folded it neatly on the table beside me. "This belongs to you," he said. "But I hope you'll let me keep the lesson." I didn't trust my voice, so I just smiled. He leaned closer, his voice lowering. "Do you know how many people walked past me today?" I shook my head. 27, he said. "Men in suits, women in pearls. Every one of them saw me, and every one of them chose not to. But you didn't just see me, you stopped." "And that," he said, tapping the table gently, "tells me everything I need to know about your character." When dinner ended, Charles stood and placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "Thank you for the meal," I said, still dazed. "No," he said softly. "Thank you for the reminder." He looked at Michael. "Son, walk Miss Stone out." It wasn't a suggestion. Michael obeyed, silent as we stepped into the hallway. His face was unreadable. The air between us was thick with something heavy. Humiliation, regret, pride, all tangled together. When the front doors closed behind us, he finally spoke. "I don't understand," he said quietly. He's never talked to anyone like that. Not even me." "Maybe you've never given him a reason to," I said, instantly regretting it. But Michael didn't get angry. He just looked lost. "I wanted him to like you. I wanted tonight to be perfect," I exhaled. "It was, Michael. Just not the kind of perfect you planned." He looked down at the scarf in my hands, the one his father had just returned to me, and shook his head slowly. "Guess I was the one being tested," he murmured. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. As we walked toward the waiting car, the mansion behind us glowing gold in the night, I realized the truth that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Compassion always costs something. Your time, your pride, your certainty. But it's never wasted. I barely slept that night. Michael dropped me off at my apartment without a word. The silence in the car had been suffocating, the kind of silence that screamed louder than any argument. When I stepped inside, I hung the scarf carefully over the back of my chair, still faintly smelling of cedar and cologne. My mind replayed every moment. The look on Charles Harper's face, the warmth in his eyes when he spoke about kindness, the pride and humiliation wrestling on Michael's. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was uneasy. This wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of something I didn't yet understand. The next morning, the world looked the same. Sunlight, traffic, the hum of life. But something inside me had shifted. I made coffee, sat by the window, and found myself staring at the scarf again. A week ago, it had just been a luxury. Now it felt like a medal. My phone buzzed. It was Michael. "My father wants to see you again. Alone." Just like that, my stomach dropped. By noon, I was standing once more at the tall iron gates of Harper Estate. The butler recognized me immediately. "Miss Stone," he said with a faint nod. "Mr. Harper is expecting you." The path leading up to the mansion felt less intimidating this time, maybe because I wasn't walking in to impress anyone. Charles was waiting in his study. The room was filled with old books and the faint scent of tobacco, sunlight filtering through heavy drapes. He wasn't dressed like a billionaire today. No tailored suit, no gold cufflinks, just a cardigan, slacks, and the same quiet authority that needed no adornment. When I entered, he gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Miss Stone," he said, smiling, "I hope I didn't startle you with the invitation." "Not at all," I lied. He studied me for a moment, as if trying to see something beneath the surface. "You remind me of someone," he said at last. My late wife. She used to say, "Charles, kindness is the only currency that never loses its value." I never listened. Not really. Then I watched you give away that scarf, and I heard her voice again. I smiled faintly. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," he said softly. "She believed that wealth without empathy is just vanity dressed up in numbers. I've been rich in vanity for too long." He poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across to me. "I imagine Michael wasn't pleased after last night." "He said he was confused," I replied carefully. "And hurt, I think." Charles nodded. "Good. Maybe confusion will make him think. He's lived his life trying to pass my tests without ever asking what I was really testing for." He leaned forward. "You passed because you didn't know there was a test. That's the point." The words settled between us. For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet ticking of a brass clock. Then Charles's tone shifted, softer. "Now tell me something, Rebecca. Why did you join the army?" The question caught me off guard. "My late grandmother," I said after a pause. "She served in Vietnam. She used to say the army gave her discipline and direction, and that service isn't about medals, it's about meaning." Charles smiled faintly. "Your grandmother was right." I hesitated. "Most people don't understand why I stayed after my first tour. My father thought I was throwing away my potential. But the army taught me something Wall Street never could. How to see people. How to lead with duty, not ego." Charles nodded approvingly. "That's precisely what our world is missing. We confuse leadership with dominance, compassion with weakness. You understand the difference?" He stood, pacing slowly to the window. "Do you know how I built this empire?" I didn't answer. "By learning to read people," he said. "And the tragic thing about power is that the higher you climb, the fewer real people you meet. Everyone wears masks." He turned, his eyes locking onto mine. "That's why I put on one myself. I wanted to see who would still stop and look." A chill ran down my spine. "You mean you've done this before?" He nodded. "Many times. In cities, small towns, train stations. Sometimes I disguise myself as a janitor, sometimes as a beggar. I've met heirs, politicians, CEOs, and soldiers. Most fail. They step over me or, worse, pretend I don't exist." He took a breath. "You didn't." I didn't know what to say. The idea that this man, this titan, spent his days wandering the world pretending to be invisible felt surreal, and yet it made a strange kind of sense. "Do you ever get tired of testing people?" I asked softly. He chuckled. "Every day, but I can't stop. It's how I stay honest." He turned back toward me. "I'm offering you something, Miss Stone. A position in my foundation. It focuses on veteran housing and transition programs. You'd have full autonomy, funding, resources. The works." I blinked. "You're serious?" He smiled. "Dead serious. You're the kind of person I built it for. I need someone who knows what service means, not as a word, but as a life." My throat tightened. "Mr. Charles, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he said kindly. I hesitated only a second before nodding. "Yes." He extended his hand. Then it settled. When I left that afternoon, I carried something heavier than opportunity. I carried understanding. Charles wasn't just testing others. He was at war with his own legacy, trying to find meaning in a world that had mistaken power for purpose. And somewhere in that strange, gilded battlefield, our paths had crossed. Outside, the autumn wind was sharp, but I didn't feel the cold. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. Not for my uniform, my background, or my family name, but for something quieter, character. And I couldn't help but wonder if my father ever saw what I'd done. If he'd heard Charles's words, would he still believe compassion was a waste of time? I doubted it, but maybe, just maybe, he'd start to understand. 3 weeks passed before I saw Charles Harper again. In that time, my world shifted in quiet, Extraordinary Ways. I began my new role at the Harper Foundation, setting up veteran outreach centers across 3 counties. For the first time, I felt like my service hadn't ended when I left the Army. It had simply changed uniforms. But change came at a price. Michael was distant. He'd stopped asking about my work, and when he did, the questions were laced with insecurity. "So now you and my father are partners," he'd say with a strained smile. Or worse, "I guess you finally found a way to impress him." I wanted to reassure him, to say that it wasn't a competition, but the truth was, Charles's respect felt different. It was earned, not inherited. One evening, an embossed envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was an invitation. Dinner Saturday, 7:00 p.m. Formal, as I thought it was just a quiet thank you. I was wrong. That night, the mansion glowed under strings of amber light. The driveway was lined with luxury cars. When the butler opened the door, the sound of soft jazz and polite laughter spilled into the night. Michael was already there, nervous again, tugging at his cufflinks. He gave me a quick, stiff smile. "You look beautiful," he said. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," I replied gently. He didn't argue. Charles greeted us at the entrance to the grand dining hall. But this time, he wasn't alone. 4 other men and 2 women were seated around the long mahogany table. Executives, board members, the kind of people who treated handshakes like chess moves. "Ah, Miss Stone," Charles said warmly. "The woman of the hour. Please, sit by me." Michael hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, as I took the seat to Charles's right, the seat that used to belong to him. Dinner began with quiet conversation. Wine poured, silverware chimed. The topic started politely. Market trends, philanthropy, housing reform, until Charles steered it toward something deeper. "Tell me," he said, his gaze sweeping the table, "what is the measure of a person's worth?" One of the executives chuckled. "Their accomplishments, of course." "Results." Another added, "Legacy." Charles's lips twitched. "Interesting answers." Then he turned to me. "Miss Stone." All eyes fell on me. I set down my fork and took a breath. "I think it's who you are when no one's watching," I said. "How you treat people who can't give you anything in return." The room went still. Charles smiled. Slow, proud, almost paternal. "Exactly," he said. "The world confuses success with virtue." But virtue, Miss Stone, is quiet. It doesn't ask for applause. Michael looked down, his face tightening. One of the board members laughed softly. "Well, not everyone can afford to be virtuous, sir. Kindness doesn't pay dividends." Charles's smile faded. "No," he said calmly. "But neither does greed in the long run. I've built my fortune watching good men destroy themselves chasing applause." This young woman reminded me that humility builds what ambition ruins. The man looked chastened. I sat frozen, unsure what to do with the mix of admiration and discomfort swirling around me. Halfway through dinner, the conversation turned toward the foundation. Charles introduced me formally. "This," he said, gesturing to me, "is the new director of veteran outreach. She'll be expanding our programs nationwide." A murmur went around the table. Surprise, respect, even envy. Michael's jaw tensed. "Wait," he said quietly. "You didn't tell me that." Charles looked at him coolly. "You didn't ask." The words hit Michael harder than any shout could have. He tried to recover with a laugh, but it came out hollow. "So that's why you invited all of us here tonight, to announce a partnership." Charles shook his head. "No, Michael. I invited you to listen." He rose from his chair, tall and commanding, his glass of wine catching the light. "For years," he began, "I built this empire believing intellect and precision were all that mattered. I taught my sons that kindness was a weakness, that empathy belonged to the powerless. But power without empathy is rot." He looked around the table, then at me. 3 weeks ago, sitting on a park bench in a worn coat, I met someone who reminded me what honor looks like. She gave what little she had to a stranger. That single act changed everything I thought I knew. Then his gaze landed on Michael. My son has always wanted my approval. But what he doesn't understand is that approval can't be inherited. It must be earned. Michael's face turned white. Dad, please. Charles continued, voice firm but not cruel. You wanted a test, Michael. Here it is. She passed because she led with her heart. You failed because you led with fear. The air was electric. The guests sat in stunned silence, pretending to sip wine but barely breathing. Finally, Charles set down his glass. I built this house on steel and pride. Tonight, I rebuild it on something better. Decency. He turned to me, eyes warm again. Rebecca, you've reminded me that wealth means nothing if it doesn't serve. You've earned my trust, and I intend to honor that. He lifted his glass once more. To integrity. A hesitant chorus echoed back. To integrity. Dinner ended quietly after that. The guests excused themselves. The butler cleared plates, and soon only the three of us remained. Michael looked shattered. His father had not just outshone him, he had exposed him. Charles placed a hand on my shoulder. Miss Stone, thank you for your honesty tonight. I know this wasn't easy. I nodded. It wasn't, I said softly, but it was right. He smiled. The right thing rarely is. Then he turned to his son. Michael, learn from her. She's shown more courage in 3 weeks than most men do in a lifetime. Michael couldn't meet his eyes. He just whispered, Yes, sir. Charles's tone softened. Don't call me sir. Call me father, and act like one. He left the room. For a long time, Michael and I sat in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. He humiliated me. No, I said gently. He gave you a chance to see him. And what did he see in you? Someone who wasn't afraid to fail the wrong test? He didn't reply. He just nodded slowly, staring down at his untouched glass of wine. I wanted to reach for his hand, but I didn't. Some lessons have to burn before they heal. The drive home that night was quiet, but not the comfortable kind. Michael gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing holding him together. The headlights cut through the dark country road, and neither of us said a word for miles. Finally, he spoke. So that's it, he said bitterly. My father thinks you're a saint, and I'm, what, a failure? I sighed. Michael, that's not what he said. It's what he meant. He laughed once, the sound sharp and brittle. You realize what tonight was, right? That was his way of telling me I'll never live up to him. That the army girl he looked down on 3 weeks ago has more integrity than his own son. That's not fair, I said gently. He's not trying to replace you. Michael turned to look at me, eyes hollow. Isn't he? When we got back to my apartment, he parked but didn't get out. I can't do this right now, he said. I just need some space. I nodded. Take what you need. He left without another word, and I watched the taillights disappear into the night. For the first time in a long time, I felt something break. Not my heart, but the illusion that love alone could fix someone. The next morning, I went to the foundation early. The offices were quiet, sunlight pouring across the rows of desks. On my desk sat a small box tied with a red ribbon. Inside was a note. To Rebecca, for proving that honor isn't a relic. And beneath it was a bronze medallion engraved with 2 words, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. I ran my thumb over the engraving, and for a moment, I saw the man from the park bench, shivering, smiling, testing the world. That's when I realized what Charles had done wasn't a test of wealth or class. It was a mirror. He wanted to see who still recognized humanity when it wasn't dressed in silk. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into work. We opened 2 new veteran housing sites, and I watched men and women once forgotten find a home again. It was exhausting and beautiful. Occasionally, Charles would visit unannounced. He never interfered. He'd just walk through, ask a few thoughtful questions, and leave behind quiet encouragement. You remind me that decency is contagious, he said once before leaving. But Michael stayed distant. Calls became short. Texts went unanswered. I'd send updates, invitations, small olive branches, but nothing bridged the silence. Until one evening, 2 months later, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. Miss Stone? The voice was thin, older. Yes, this is Victor Stone, your father. It had been almost a year since we'd spoken. He cleared his throat. Your mother told me what happened. The dinner, the billionaire, the scarf thing. I smiled faintly. News travels fast. He chuckled awkwardly. Well, it's not every day your daughter impresses one of the richest men in America. There was a pause. Then his tone softened. Rebecca, I think I owe you an apology. I blinked. For what? For being wrong, he said simply. About people, about service, about you. He sighed heavily. When you joined the army, I thought you were running away from success. Turns out you were running toward it. I just didn't recognize the kind. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Dad, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he interrupted. You remember what I used to say about street vets? Don't waste time on them, I said quietly. Yeah, he muttered. Turns out I was the one wasting time. That broke me. I covered my mouth, tears spilling before I could stop them. He cleared his throat again, embarrassed by emotion. Anyway, your mother and I would love to see you. Maybe next Sunday, dinner. I smiled through the tears. I'd love that. When I hung up, I just sat there for a while, letting the quiet wrap around me like the scarf had wrapped around Charles that first day. Life, I realized, was strange that way. The lessons we ignore from our parents sometimes come back so we can teach them in return. A few weeks later, I received another letter, this one handwritten in careful, deliberate script. Rebecca, the dinner was not about power. It was about redemption. I built walls to protect what I thought mattered, but walls only keep the truth out. You helped me see that. Thank you for reminding me that leadership begins with humility. I hope you'll visit again soon. There's a place at the table that belongs to you always. Charles. I folded the letter carefully and placed it next to the medallion. That weekend, I visited my parents. The house smelled like pot roast and nostalgia. My mother hugged me so tightly, I thought my ribs might crack. My father was quieter. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes misty. When we sat for dinner, he lifted his glass awkwardly. To Rebecca, he said, for teaching an old man that compassion isn't weakness. I raised mine. To second chances. For the first time in years, we ate without argument, without judgment, just peace. Later that night, as I drove home, I saw a man standing near the off-ramp, holding a cardboard sign that read, Veteran hungry, please help. Traffic was slow. The light was red. I reached into the passenger seat, pulled out the spare sandwich I'd packed earlier, and rolled down the window. Here, I said, it's not much, but it's yours. The man smiled, tired and grateful. Thank you, ma'am, he said softly. Then he looked up, eyes catching the streetlight, blue and steady like Charles's, and I could almost hear his voice again. Kindness is the last true luxury. That night, I wrote a note in my journal. Just one sentence. The world changes one small act at a time. It wasn't a lesson my father taught me. It was one I'd learned on my own, and somehow that made it all the more precious. 6 months later, the world felt softer. Not easier, just more honest. The Harper Foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. Veterans who had once slept in cars now had jobs, apartments, and second chances. Every time I saw one of them smile, I thought of that park bench, the beginning of everything. Charles kept in touch often, sometimes through letters, sometimes by showing up unexpectedly at the outreach centers, talking quietly with the men and women we helped. He didn't like being thanked. He said gratitude was best shown, not spoken. And Michael, well, he changed too, slowly. He came to the foundation one afternoon unannounced, standing awkwardly in the lobby like a man trying to find his place in a world he'd once mocked. "I wanted to see what you built," he said. "What we built," I corrected gently. He smiled, tentative but real. "You were right," he admitted. "My father wasn't trying to humiliate me. He was trying to wake me up." That night we talked for hours. No accusations, no ego, just truth. And somewhere in that honesty, we found the beginning of something new. Not the kind of love built on fear or approval, but on respect. Spring arrived like forgiveness. When the invitations went out for our wedding, they were simple: ivory cardstock, navy ink, and a single embossed motto at the bottom: Semper Fidelis, always faithful. We didn't choose a ballroom or a country club. We chose my parents' backyard, under a canopy of maple trees. My father built the arch himself. My mother wept when she saw it finished. The morning of the ceremony, the sky was the color of promise. My father met me at the edge of the garden, dressed in his old navy suit, looking both proud and nervous. "You sure about this?" he asked softly. I smiled, more sure than I've ever been. He nodded, his voice catching. "You know, I used to think strength meant standing above everyone else. Turns out, it means standing with them." I took his hand. "That's all I ever wanted you to see." Guests filled the chairs. Veterans, co-workers, friends. And at the front, standing beside Michael, was Charles Harper. Gone was the imposing billionaire in his castle. He wore a simple gray suit. Around his shoulders, draped neatly like a Medal of Honor, was my cashmere scarf. When our eyes met, he smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that said everything words couldn't. As the music began, my father whispered, "He's wearing it again." "I know," I said, my throat tightening. "He understands what it means." The ceremony was small, heartfelt, unpretentious. When the minister spoke the vows, the wind carried his words across the garden like a benediction. "I, Rebecca Stone, take you, Michael Harper." I glanced at Charles and saw him watching, his eyes glistening, pride and peace written across his face. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about us. It was about all of them. My father, who learned that compassion isn't weakness, Michael, who learned humility, and Charles, who rediscovered his faith in humanity. When it was Charles's turn to give a toast, he stood slowly, leaning on his cane, the scarf still around his shoulders. "I've spent my life building walls," he began, voice steady and low. "Walls made of marble, pride, and fear. And then one young woman came along and reminded me that the strongest walls are built not to keep others out, but to hold love in." He looked at me. "Rebecca, you gave me the one thing I thought money couldn't buy, a second chance at being a good man." He raised his glass. "To honor, to kindness, and to always being faithful to the values that outlive us all." The guests echoed softly. "To honor, to kindness." After dinner, he asked to speak to my father privately. I watched them from across the yard. Two men who had once stood on opposite ends of every measure of success, now shaking hands beneath a string of garden lights. When they returned, my father looked years lighter. "He's not what I expected," he admitted. "No one ever is," I said. Later that night, as the guests began to leave, I stood alone for a moment under the trees. Fireflies blinked in the distance. I thought about the man I'd met on that park bench, the cold day that had started this whole journey. I thought about how easy it would have been to walk past him, how close I came to living a smaller life because I was afraid to stop. Charles joined me quietly, hands folded behind his back. "You know," he said, "I still take those walks sometimes. Sit on that same bench, just to see if people will stop." I smiled. "Do they?" He chuckled softly. Sometimes. Not often enough. Maybe someday, I said. They'll all learn. He nodded. Maybe. But change begins one person at a time. You reminded me of that. Before he left, he placed something in my hand. The bronze medallion he'd given me months earlier. Keep it close, he said. Not as a token, but as a reminder. Honor isn't about what others see in you. It's about what you do when no one's watching. I looked down at it, the words glinting in the candlelight. Semper Fidelis. When I looked back up, he was already walking away, the scarf trailing softly behind him. That night, after everyone was gone, Michael and I sat beneath the arch my father had built. The air smelled of lilacs and rain. He took my hand. You know, he said quietly, I used to think you ruined that first dinner. I laughed. I did. He smiled. No, you saved it. You saved us. We sat in silence, the kind that doesn't need filling, the kind that speaks of peace. And somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed, the same sound I'd heard that fateful day when I stepped off the platform and saw a stranger on a bench. Only now, I knew it hadn't been chance. It had been purpose. If you've stayed with me this far, I hope this story reminds you of something simple, that every small act of decency matters, that we're all someone's test without knowing it, and that the real measure of a life isn't wealth, rank, or perfection. It's compassion. So next time you see someone forgotten by the world, a veteran, a neighbor, a stranger on a park bench, stop, smile, offer what you can. You never know what kind of story might begin there. If this story touched you, share it. Tell someone about it. And remember, be kind, be faithful, and always choose honor.